The Arab Spring refers to the wave of protests that took place in the Middle East and North Africa. These pro-democracy protests began in 2010 and 2011. They challenged some of the region's long-standing leaders. Demonstrators expressed anger towards government that did not give people back many freedoms. Governments responded violently to many of the protesters. In January and February 2011, protests erupted in Egypt and Tunisia, two countries in North Africa. In a few weeks, their leaders were overthrown. Many were surprised when this happened because the governments of Egypt and Tunisia were believed to be stable. The first demonstrations took place in December 2010. They started after a 26-year-old worker named Mohamed Bouazizi burned himself alive. He was protesting his treatment by local officials. A protest movement quickly spread throughout the country. The government attempted to end the unrest by offering the protesters some of what they wanted. The government also tried to use violence. Protests soon became overwhelming, and President Zine el-Abidine Ben stepped forward and left the country in 2011. New leaders were chosen in elections. They took office in December, 1 year after the protests began. Huge protests broke out in late January 11. The Egyptian government tried to use similar tactics as the Tunisian government. They failed, however. A turning point came when the Egyptian army announced that it would refuse to use force against protesters. President Hosni Mubarak left office February 11, 2011. After nearly 30 years, he handed power to a council of military officers. The new military government started out with great public support. However, people were angered when the new government did not want to hold elections. It also used force against protesters. Still, elections proceeded as scheduled. The newly elected People's Assembly met for the first time in late January 2012. The aftermath of the Arab Spring in Egypt is still unfolding. A group called the Muslim Brotherhood won elections in 2012. At the time, many in the country were hopeful. Newly elected President Mohamed Morsi appointed a former military officer, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, as others around the Middle East were inspired by the protests. In Tunisia and Egypt, protest movements took hold in Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria. These protests led to long, bloody struggles through Yemen. The first protest started in late January 2011. They called for President Abdullah Saleh to step down. Negotiations failed and there was clashes in the largest city. In February 2012, Vice President Mansour Hadi took over the government. An election was held, but Hadi was the only candidate on the ballot. Political transition in Yemen has not gone well. Fighting soon broke out between a number of groups. Hadi resigned in 2015 and eventually fled to neighboring Saudi Arabia. Many still recognize him as the country's leader, though. Saudi Arabia still recognizes him as Yemen's leader and has been bombing armed rebel groups in Yemen. As a result of the fighting, the country has not had a functional government. Even before conflict broke out, about half of the people in Yemen were living in poverty. By early 2017, millions in the country did not have enough food. Many were dying of starvation. Bahrain. Bahrain is a tiny country near Saudi Arabia. Mass protests erupted in mid-February 2011. They were led by the Bahraini human rights activists. Many were Shiites, who are followers of the type of Islam called Shia Islam. Though Shiites are the majority in Bahrain, they are discriminated against. Bahrain is ruled by a Sunni monarchy. Sunnis practice a different form of Islam. Protests were violently ended by March of 2011. Dozens of accused protest leaders were imprisoned. Many Shiite mosques were demolished. Still, the government vowed to make changes. Since then, there have been many protests. Shiites have been demanding more rights. Libya. Protest against Muammar al-Gaddafi began in mid-February 2011. They quickly escalated. Gaddafi ruled Libya for more than 40 years. After countries, including the United States, came together to help the rebels, Gaddafi was forced from power in August 2011. Gaddafi was killed in October 2011 as the rebel forces took control. After Gaddafi's death, the new government took power that was meant to be temporary. It struggled to make life better for Libyan people. They also had difficulty controlling the many small armies that had participated in a fight against Gaddafi. A number of armed groups continued fighting for control over parts of Libya. The control has no effective government. Syria. Protests began in mid-March 2011. They called for the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad. Assad responded with a crackdown against protesters. Opposition groups began to launch attacks on government forces over the summer. Still, Assad held strongly onto power with the support of the religious minority to which he belongs. Divisions in the international community made it unlikely that other countries would help in the fight. Russia and China supported Assad and did not want any help for the rebels. The civil war was gone on since 2011. Thousands of Syrians have died and millions have fled the country as refugees. Effects of the Arab Spring. The effects were left elsewhere throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Many of the countries in the region experienced at least a small pro-democracy protest. In Algeria, Jordan, Morocco, and Oman, rulers actively tried to prevent protests. They dismissed unpopular officials. Some made changes to the constitutions.